The alarm in my chamber did not politely chime. It screamed, a sound our archive systems are not built to make, because nothing in 300 years had ever warranted it. I dropped the data crystal I was holding, and it cracked against the floor, and I remember thinking, even before I understood what was happening, that I had just destroyed a record older than my own bloodline. Then the screaming stopped, and a single line of text appeared on every screen in the deep archive at once. Signal detected. Origin, sealed sector. Classification, Terran. I read it 3 times before my mind accepted the shape of the words. I am Vex Thara, and at that point in my life I had spent 6 years cataloging the oldest, strangest, most dismissed records our people still kept. I knew the word Terran the way a child knows the name of a monster from a story told to make them behave. I did not expect to ever type it into a report. I ran through the lower halls of the archive, past shelves of crystal that held the memory of 1,000 dead languages, until I reached the sealed vault where the pre-silence files were kept. Only 3 people in the entire Concord had clearance to open that vault, and I was not one of them. I stood outside the door anyway, breathing hard, staring at the warning etched into the metal frame, words so old that the script had to be translated twice before it reached our current tongue. Do not answer them. Do not seek them. If they wake, let them sleep again. I had read that warning 100 times before as a curiosity, an old fear from a nervous generation, nothing more. Standing there with the alarm still ringing faintly behind me, it did not feel like a curiosity anymore. Word travels fast when fear is involved, and by the time I reached the upper council chamber, half the senior staff were already arguing. Director Osirel, the oldest and calmest official I had ever worked under, was standing at the head of the table with his hands pressed flat against the surface, as if he could hold the room still through pressure alone. I want to be clear about something, because I was young and I misjudged everything that followed. I did not believe the old tales. Not really. I had spent years around the archive's oldest records, and I had learned that our ancestors loved drama. Every extinct predator became a demon in their retellings. Every lost war became a divine punishment. So when I heard the word Terran spoken aloud by frightened officials, some small, arrogant part of me assumed this was simply another exaggerated legend meeting reality and shrinking down to something manageable. Director Osirel called for silence, and the room obeyed him the way rooms obey people who have never once raised their voice and never needed to. The signal is old technology, he said. Deliberately old. Whoever sent it wanted to be found using a method we would recognize. That is not the signature of an accident. That is a decision. A younger counselor, Catherine, argued for immediate withdrawal, sealing the sector further, pretending the signal had never been received. Another argued the opposite, that hiding from something already found only invites it closer. I stood near the back of the chamber, not important enough to speak, and listened to grown officials argue like hatchlings over a decision none of them wanted to make. In the end, they chose the option that satisfied nobody completely. A small diplomatic vessel would be sent, minimal crew, minimal weapons, maximum caution. Its purpose was not to negotiate a future. Its purpose was to look, carefully, from a safe distance, and report back before anyone committed to anything larger. I was assigned as translator. I want to explain why, because it says something about how little anyone respected the old warnings at that point. Nobody senior wanted to go. Nobody with rank wanted their name attached to a mission that might end their career, or worse. So the task fell to the archivist who had spent years reading dead languages nobody else cared about, the one person in the building who might actually recognize fragments of ancient Terran speech if we heard any. I was terrified and, if I am honest, a little thrilled. I had spent my whole professional life reading about the dead. I did not expect to meet anything alive. The ship they gave us was called the Aldrin's Hollow, an old survey vessel repurposed for the mission because nothing faster was available on short notice. Our captain, a quiet and methodical officer named Doyle Ashford, in the human tongue his people would later teach me, though of course our species does not use such names among ourselves, briefed the crew twice before departure, and both times ended with the same instruction. We observe, we do not provoke. If anything about this feels wrong, we leave immediately, and we do not argue about it afterward. I remember thinking that instruction sounded almost insulting in its simplicity, as if we were preparing to meet something dangerously unpredictable rather than a colony of ordinary people. I did not yet understand that caution is not an insult. It is a debt paid in advance. The flight out took 11 days. I spent most of it in the ship's small archive terminal, rereading everything I could find about the ancient conflict, trying to separate fact from exaggeration. Most of what remained was fragments, a treaty with no explanation of what it ended, a star map with an entire region blacked out and labeled only as sealed by mutual agreement, a single surviving phrase repeated across 3 unrelated records from 3 different species, translated slightly differently each time but always carrying the same weight. They do not stop. That is the only warning worth remembering. Everything else is detail. I read that line so many times it stopped feeling like words and started feeling like a rhythm, something my mind repeated without meaning to. I told myself it was old fear talking, the kind of phrase frightened survivors invent to explain a defeat they didn't understand. I told myself a lot of things during those 11 days, and I believed most of them right up until we dropped out of transit at the edge of the sealed sector and saw, for the first time, an ordinary point of light that our sensors quietly identified as an inhabited world. It did not look like a monster's lair. It looked like nothing at all, which somehow unsettled me more than any imagined horror could have. We approached slowly, scanning constantly, watching for any sign of the massive defenses the old stories implied should be waiting for us. There were none. No orbital fortresses, no hidden fleets bristling along the approach vectors. Just a modest world with a handful of settlements, faint communication traffic, and an atmosphere that looked, according to our instruments, perfectly survivable. "This is it," Catherine said quietly over the comm from the observation deck, and I could hear the disappointment in her voice. "This is the terror our ancestors sealed an entire sector to avoid." I laughed, actually laughed, out of nervous relief, and said something dismissive in return, something about old stories always growing in the retelling. I was wrong, and I would spend the following weeks, slowly, uncomfortably, learning exactly how wrong, but in that moment, floating above an unremarkable world with untroubled skies, I believed the ancient warnings had finally been proven false. We were given permission to make contact. The colony's administrator, a woman whose voice carried none of the caution ours had, welcomed us with what felt like genuine warmth, and arranged a modest meeting at a small outpost near the edge of their largest settlement. I remember stepping off our shuttle and feeling the strange, thin gravity of an unfamiliar world settle into my legs, and I remember the first human I ever saw walking toward us with an expression that was, unmistakably, a smile. Her name was Grace Whitfield, and she introduced herself with a simple handshake and an apology for the modest surroundings, as if we had caught her mid-renovation rather than at the edge of a sealed sector her ancestors had once fought a war to close off. She offered food, she offered rest. She asked about our journey with what sounded like real curiosity rather than practiced diplomacy. I stood there, translator protocols running quietly in the back of my mind, and I thought, with the particular arrogance of someone young enough to trust first impressions completely, that the old records had been wrong about everything. These were not monsters. These were not the tireless, unstoppable horrors described in fragments too old to fully translate. These were people offering us tea in a small room with uneven lighting, laughing at their own jokes, asking polite questions about where we came from. I did not yet understand that the old warnings had never claimed humans were monsters. They had only ever claimed one simple, terrible thing. They do not stop, and I had not yet seen anything that would make them start. We stayed on that world for 11 days, and every one of them chipped away, quietly, at the comfortable conclusion I had reached on our first afternoon there. It started with small things. Grace Whitfield walked us through the settlement on our second day, past modest homes built from local stone and imported metal, past workshops, where children no older than what I would call early adolescence were repairing machinery with a calm competence that startled me. I asked her, half joking, whether their children were trained as engineers from birth. "Not engineers," she said, smiling in that easy way of hers. "Just taught to fix what breaks. Out here, if something stops working and you don't know how to make it work again, you don't get a second chance to learn." I remember writing that down in my notes without fully understanding why it unsettled me. It was such a simple statement, practical, reasonable, and yet it carried an undertone I couldn't name at the time, a suggestion that this colony existed at the edge of something harder than comfort, and had built its entire culture around never being caught unprepared. On the third day, one of our engineers, a careful and skeptical man named Catherine's assistant Price, asked their chief technician for a tour of the settlement's power systems, expecting to find something crude, patched together from salvage. Instead, he returned to our ship pale and quiet, and it took him almost an hour to explain what he'd seen. "They solved a stability problem in their reactor housing," he said, "that our own engineering councils have called unsolvable for 40 years. And when I asked how long it took them to figure it out, the technician just shrugged and said it took his grandfather about a week." We laughed about it that evening, the way people laugh when they are trying to convince themselves something is not important. A week. 40 years of failure on our side, solved in a week by someone's grandfather with what looked like ordinary tools. I told myself it was an isolated case, a single bright mind in an otherwise unremarkable colony. I would keep telling myself variations of that excuse for days longer than I should have. The deeper unease came from something harder to quantify than technical skill. It came from watching how humans moved through their own lives. I spent an afternoon with Grace Whitfield's assistant, a quiet young man named Owen Blake, who had been assigned to help translate local customs for our records. He was patient, funny, endlessly willing to answer questions, and completely unbothered by anything I asked him, no matter how strange it must have sounded coming from someone clearly unfamiliar with his species. But there was a particular moment that stayed with me long after we left that world. I asked him, casually, what humans did when a problem seemed impossible to solve. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely considering the question rather than offering a rehearsed answer, and said, "We usually just keep trying things until something works. Sometimes that takes an afternoon, sometimes it takes generations, but somebody usually keeps trying." I asked what happened if nothing worked at all, if the problem truly had no solution. He shrugged, in that same easy, unbothered way Grace had shrugged about her colony's reactor. "Then we find a way to survive the problem instead of solving it, and we keep looking for a solution anyway, just in case the next generation gets lucky." It was such an ordinary answer, said without any weight, any drama, any sense that it should mean anything at all. And yet it sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of that day, because I realized, slowly and uncomfortably, that I had never once heard anyone from my own species describe an approach to failure with that particular calm. We had contingency protocols. We had risk assessments. We had entire departments dedicated to deciding when a problem was not worth the cost of continuing to attempt it. Humans, it seemed, did not have an equivalent concept. Not because they were reckless, because giving up simply did not appear to be part of how they thought. I brought my growing unease to Director Osserell privately, on the 6th day, hoping he would either share it or talk me out of it. He did neither. He listened carefully, the way he always listened, and then he said something I did not expect. "I have noticed the same thing," he admitted. "Every conversation I have with their administrator ends the same way. She agrees to everything reasonable. She offers everything we ask for. She has been, by any measure, an ideal host. And still, something about the arrangement feels incomplete, as though we are only being shown exactly what she has decided we should see, and nothing more." I asked him if he thought that meant they were hiding something dangerous. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think it means they have learned, somewhere in their history, exactly how much information is safe to share with people who have not yet earned their trust. That is not the behavior of a species with nothing to hide, but it is also not, necessarily, the behavior of a species planning harm. It may simply be the behavior of a species that remembers being underestimated and has decided never to make that mistake about themselves again. That answer did not comfort me the way I wanted it to. On the 8th day, I finally asked Grace Whitfield the question I had been avoiding since our arrival. We were sitting on a low bench outside the settlement's main hall, watching the local sun set behind distant hills, and I asked her, as gently as I could manage, why her people had chosen to live so far from the rest of Concord space, in a sealed sector nobody else was permitted to enter. She was quiet for a while before she answered, and when she did, her voice had lost some of its earlier warmth, replaced by something more careful. "We didn't choose the ceiling," she said. "Your people did that, a long time ago, after a conflict most of us only know through stories now. But we chose to stay here afterward, even once we could have asked to leave. We chose it on purpose." I asked her why. She looked at me directly, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I saw something in her expression that reminded me, faintly, of the caution I'd read about in the old records. "Because it seemed like the responsible thing to do," she said. "We were young once, as a species, loud and clumsy, and not always careful with our strength. We hurt people we didn't mean to hurt, simply because we didn't understand our own limits yet. Staying here, apart, gave us time to understand ourselves better before we went looking for company again. It felt safer for everyone, including you." I did not know how to respond to that. I remember sitting there, watching the strange sunset, turning her words over and over, and feeling for the first time since our arrival a genuine chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. I reported the conversation to Director Osserell that night, and he made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He requested, formally and cautiously, that our mission be extended, and that a small Concord diplomatic presence remain on the colony while a larger delegation prepared to follow. He framed it, in his official message, as an opportunity to build lasting trust with a long, isolated but clearly capable civilization. Privately, when I asked him why he had chosen to stay, rather than withdraw, as our original orders suggested, he gave me an answer I have never forgotten. "Because I would rather understand them slowly, on their terms, while things are calm," he said, "than be forced to understand them quickly, on someone else's terms, when they are not." Neither of us knew, at the time, exactly how soon that second scenario would arrive. We did not have long to wait. On the 10th day, our sensors picked up unfamiliar signatures entering the outer edge of the system, moving with the deliberate, confident pattern of a fleet that expected no resistance. I recognized the configuration from old intelligence records the moment our own analysts confirmed it. Skarn Dominion vessels, not a scouting party, a strike force. I remember standing on the observation deck of the Aldrin's Hollow, watching those distant signatures grow slowly clearer on our display, and feeling a strange, sinking certainty settle over me. The Skarn had a long history of testing the edges of unclaimed or unprotected territory, probing for weakness with quick, brutal efficiency before anyone could organize a proper response. They had clearly heard the same rumors we had, about an isolated, low-defended colony sitting at the edge of a sealed sector, and they had drawn a very different conclusion than caution. They saw an easy target. I looked over at Director Osserell, who was watching the same display with an expression I had never seen on him before, something between alarm and, strangely, a kind of grim curiosity. "They are going to attack a world that solved a 40-year engineering problem in a week," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I do not know whether to warn them, or simply watch." We chose to warn them, of course. It was the only decision either of us could have lived with. But as our comm officer opened a channel to alert the settlement of the incoming force, I found myself thinking back to Owen Blake's easy, unbothered voice, describing how his people handled impossible problems. "We usually just keep trying things until something works." I did not yet know what that philosophy looked like when it was applied to a battle instead of a broken reactor. I was about to find out, and so was every Skarn commander who had assumed, wrongly, that an unremarkable world with no visible defenses meant an easy victory. The warning reached the settlement within minutes, and I expected panic. I expected the kind of chaos I had read about in reports from other vulnerable colonies, caught unprepared by a sudden threat, people scrambling, shouting, contradicting each other in fear. What I saw instead, watching through our shuttle's external feed as we were brought down closer to the main settlement, at Grace Whitfield's request, was something so orderly it felt almost rehearsed. Alarms sounded, calm and steady rather than frantic. Families moved toward shelters in organized groups, parents guiding children with quiet instructions rather than raised voices. Within 20 minutes, the streets outside the main hall were nearly empty, and the only people still visible were a small number of adults moving with clear purpose toward a modest command structure near the settlement's edge. Grace Whitfield met us there herself, and if she was afraid, she hid it completely behind the same steady calm she had shown us since our arrival. "This has happened before," she said, when I asked how her people had organized so quickly. "Not often, but often enough that we don't leave it to chance anymore." I asked her what she meant by "it has happened before," and she gave me a brief, unembellished account of 2 earlier incidents, decades apart, when other opportunistic forces had probed the edges of human territory, expecting easy resources, and found something else entirely. She did not describe those encounters with pride or menace. She described them the way someone might describe a difficult winter that had simply been endured and prepared for ever since. Our own crew, meanwhile, was far less composed. Catherine argued forcefully that we should evacuate immediately, that our small diplomatic vessel had no business remaining anywhere near an active engagement between 2 forces we barely understood. Director Osirel overruled her, calmly but firmly, insisting that our departure now, in the middle of an unprovoked attack on people who had welcomed us as guests, would be both a moral failure and a diplomatic one we could never fully repair. We stayed, and I remained close to the command structure at his side, translating when needed, though as the following hours unfolded, I found there was less and less need for my skills, because I could understand almost everything happening simply by watching. The Skarn force arrived in the system with the confidence of an army that had already decided the outcome before the first shot was ever fired. Their transmissions, which our systems intercepted and I helped translate for the human command staff, were not even directed at the colony. They were internal communications between Skarn officers, casual, almost bored, discussing how quickly they expected the operation to conclude and how the resources they intended to claim would be distributed once resistance, if any existed at all, was dealt with. I watched Grace Whitfield's expression as she listened to my translation of those transmissions. She did not look angry. She looked, if anything, almost sad, the way someone looks when they hear a stranger confidently describe a plan built entirely on a mistaken assumption. "They think this will be easy," she said quietly. "Will it not be?" I asked, and I meant it honestly. I still did not fully understand what I was watching. She looked at me, and for the first time since we had met, her calm expression carried something harder beneath it. It could have been easy for them, if they'd simply asked for help instead of coming to take it. We would have given them what we could spare. Now it's going to be something else entirely, and I wish it didn't have to be. The first wave of Skarn ships entered close orbit within the hour, and I braced myself for the devastating, indiscriminate assault the old records had hinted at when describing what happened to those who provoked the ancient conflict. It did not come. Instead, the human defense response, when it activated, was almost startlingly restrained. Automated systems around the settlement's perimeter activated with quiet efficiency, disabling the first advance shuttles attempting to land troops rather than destroying them outright. Communication channels remained open the entire time, broadcasting a single, calm, repeated message toward the Skarn fleet, offered in their own language with a patience that struck me as almost unnatural given the circumstances. "This world is defended. Withdraw now and no further action will be taken. This is your only warning." I turned to Director Osirel, confused by what I was witnessing. "They are being polite," I said. In the middle of an attack, they are being polite. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reverent. That's the dangerous part, Vexthara. They are not restrained because they lack the ability to respond. They are restrained because they are choosing to give their attacker every possible chance to walk away first. That is not the behavior of a species testing its limits. That is the behavior of a species that already knows exactly what it is capable of, and is trying very hard not to use it unless it becomes absolutely necessary. The Skarn commander, whoever he was, either did not receive the warning clearly or simply did not believe it. Rather than withdrawing, the fleet pressed forward, launching a second and much larger wave, clearly intent on overwhelming what they still assumed was a lightly defended world through sheer numbers. That was the moment everything I thought I understood about the ancient warnings finally, completely, fell apart. I do not have adequate words, even now, to fully describe what I witnessed over the following hours, and I want to be careful in how I describe it, because I do not wish to glorify what was, ultimately, a tragedy for everyone involved, including the Skarn who did not need to lose what they lost that day. What I can say is that the modest, unassuming colony I had spent 10 days quietly underestimating revealed, layer by layer, a depth of preparation that our own Concord defense analysts would spend years afterward trying to fully understand. Hidden facilities beneath the settlement's outer hills opened, facilities our own scanning equipment had passed over repeatedly without ever detecting, revealing defense platforms that had clearly been built decades earlier and simply, deliberately, left unused until they were needed. Vessels that had been sitting quietly in orbit, registered in our earlier scans as simple cargo haulers, revealed modular defense systems built directly into their hulls, activated with a speed that suggested extensive, practiced coordination rather than improvisation. But what struck me most was not the technology, it was the people. I watched through the command center's shared displays as human pilots and technicians who had been, only hours earlier, repairing irrigation equipment and teaching children basic engineering, moved into defensive positions with a calm, practiced competence that made it clear this was not the first time they had trained for exactly this scenario. There was no panic in their voices over the comm channels. There was no hesitation. There was only steady, coordinated effort, adjusted constantly in response to whatever the Skarn attempted, adapting faster than I would have believed possible for a force this size, this quickly assembled. The Skarn fleet, expecting a swift and one-sided engagement, instead found itself facing a defense that seemed to anticipate every maneuver before it was fully executed. I watched Skarn formations attempt encirclement tactics, only to find human response vessels already positioned to counter them. I watched Skarn commanders shift strategy repeatedly, growing visibly more frantic in their intercepted communications, as each new approach was met not with panic, but with calm, incremental adjustment. Grace Whitfield stood near the center of the command structure throughout, coordinating with a quiet, focused intensity that never once broke into anger or triumph. At one point, midway through the engagement, she turned to Director Osirel and said something I did not expect. "We're giving them another chance to withdraw," she said. "The automated channel is still broadcasting. If they take it, this ends here, and everyone gets to go home." Director Osirel asked her, carefully, why she would extend that offer twice, given how the first warning had been ignored. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because the alternative is worse for everyone, including us. We don't enjoy this. We just refuse to lose at it." The Skarn commander did not take the second chance either, whether out of pride, poor judgment, or simple disbelief that a colony this size could genuinely outmatch a full strike force. The attack continued, escalating further as Skarn reinforcements arrived from elsewhere in the system. And in response, so did the human defense, methodically, without a single wasted motion, matching every increase in pressure with a corresponding increase in capability that seemed to have no discernible ceiling. I remember turning to Kethryn at one point, watching the tactical display update in real time and asking her the question that had been building in my chest since our very first day on that world. "How deep does this go?" I asked. "How much more do they have that we haven't seen yet?" She did not answer because she did not know, and neither did anyone else on our ship. That, I would come to understand, was precisely the point. The old warnings had never claimed humans possessed some single, terrible weapon that made them unbeatable. They had claimed something far more unsettling, that no matter how much force was brought against them, humans would simply keep adapting, keep enduring, keep responding, layer after layer, until whatever opposed them either withdrew or was worn down entirely by the sheer, relentless persistence of a species that had apparently never learned how to stop trying. By the time the engagement reached its final hours, the once confident Skarn fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, its remaining vessels attempting a disorganized withdrawal that the human defense allowed without pursuit. I noted that detail specifically because it told me something important. They were not interested in destruction for its own sake. The moment the threat ended, so did the response, immediately and completely, with no lingering aggression, no pursuit of a defeated enemy who no longer posed a danger. Grace Whitfield watched the final Skarn ships leave the system with an expression I can only describe as tired relief, rather than victory. "I wish they had just asked for help," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "It would have been so much easier for everyone." I stood beside her, still processing everything I had witnessed, and I felt, for the first time since arriving on that world, the full and complete weight of the warning etched into our archive vault door. They do not stop. That is the only warning worth remembering. I finally understood, standing in that quiet command center as the last Skarn signatures faded from the display, that the warning had never been an exaggeration born from ancient fear. It had been, all along, a simple and precise description of exactly what we had just watched happen. And I found myself wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, what our ancestors must have experienced to write that warning down in the first place, and how much worse it must have been for them to feel the need to seal an entire sector shut, simply to avoid ever testing it again. In the days that followed the withdrawal of the Skarn fleet, I expected the settlement to celebrate. I had read enough about victorious defenses in Concord history to expect gatherings, speeches, some public acknowledgement of what had just been survived. Instead, the colony returned to its normal rhythms almost immediately, as though the entire engagement had been an unwelcome interruption to an ordinary week rather than a moment worth marking. Children returned to their lessons. Engineers returned to their unfinished repairs. Grace Whitfield spent the morning after the attack overseeing the restoration of a damaged water system on the settlement's eastern edge, moving between tasks with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the engagement itself. I found the contrast unsettling in a way I struggled to articulate to Director Osserell when he asked for my observations. "They fought a battle that would have taken most Concord worlds months to recover from," I told him, "and by the next morning it is as though nothing happened at all." He considered that for a long moment before responding. "Perhaps that is exactly the point, Vexthara. A species that expects conflict as a recurring possibility cannot afford to be paralyzed by it every time it occurs. They grieve, certainly, in whatever ways they grieve, but they do not allow the grieving to stop the work that keeps them alive. I suspect that is a skill built over a very long and difficult history." It was during those quieter days, once the immediate danger had passed, that I finally began to see the fuller shape of what our old warnings had actually been describing, and I want to be honest that the picture that emerged was far more complicated and far less monstrous than the fear-soaked fragments in our archive had led me to expect. I spent an afternoon with Owen Blake, walking through a section of the settlement I had not yet visited, a modest memorial garden near the center of the community, filled with simple markers bearing names I could not read without his help. He explained, without being asked, that the garden held markers not only for members of their own colony lost over the generations, but for a small number of Skarn as well, from an earlier incident decades before ours. I asked him why they would honor those who had come to attack them. He was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness I had come to associate with him. Because they died making a mistake, not out of hatred, he said finally, and a mistake like that deserves to be remembered honestly, not erased just because it makes the story simpler. We're not trying to be the villains in anyone's history, even when we win. That conversation stayed with me longer than almost anything else from our time on that world. I had arrived expecting either a peaceful, unremarkable people or a hidden threat waiting to reveal itself. What I found instead was something far harder to categorize, a species that had clearly, at some point in its history, been forced to become extraordinarily capable of enduring and responding to violence, and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, not to let that capability define who they wanted to be. Director Osirel requested a formal meeting with Grace Whitfield on our final full day on the colony, and he invited me to attend as translator, though by that point I suspected he simply wanted a witness he trusted to help him process what we had both experienced. We sat together in the same modest room where we had first been welcomed, and he asked her, as directly as diplomatic protocol allowed, the question that had clearly been on his mind since the attack ended. "How much of what we saw represents the full extent of your capability?" he asked, "and how much was simply what this particular situation required?" Grace Whitfield considered the question carefully before answering, and when she did, her voice carried none of the pride or menace I might have expected from a leader who had just overseen the defeat of a full invasion force. "I honestly don't know how to answer that in a way that would satisfy you," she said. "We don't measure ourselves that way. Not anymore. We used to, a long time ago, and it cost us more than I think your records probably describe. What I can tell you is that we try very hard to only use exactly what a situation requires, and never more than that, because we learned the hard way what happens when that restraint disappears." I asked her, carefully, what exactly had been learned, hoping she might finally offer some clearer picture of the ancient conflict our own records had left so incomplete. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, as though she recognized in my question the same fear that had driven our ancestors to seal an entire sector shut generations ago. "That's a longer story," she said, "and I think it deserves more than a single conversation before we leave. Would you be willing to stay a little longer and let me try to explain it properly?" Director Osirel looked to me, and I understood immediately that this decision, more than any other we had made since our arrival, was one he wanted my input on as well. I found myself nodding without hesitation, driven by the same instinct that had made me an archivist in the first place, an unwillingness to leave any old story only partially understood. We stayed 3 additional days, during which Grace Whitfield, along with a small number of trusted colony elders, began the slow, careful process of explaining what their people remembered of the conflict that had led to the sealing of the entire sector so long ago. It was a patient, sometimes painful unfolding of history, told across quiet conversations in the memorial garden, in the settlement's modest archive room, and once, memorably, sitting together on the same low bench where Grace and I had first spoken honestly about her people's isolation. I will not pretend I understood everything they shared with us in those 3 days. Much of it concerned events and losses that belonged, in the truest sense, only to them, and I do not believe it is my place to recount every detail here. But I can say this. The old warning our ancestors had written, the one I had spent years dismissing as exaggerated fear, had never actually been about cruelty, or conquest, or malice at all. It had been about scale, and about restraint, and about what happens when a species capable of near limitless adaptation and endurance is pushed past the point where restraint feels possible anymore. Our ancestors had not sealed that sector because humanity was evil. They had sealed it, I came to understand, at least in part because humanity itself had asked them to, in the aftermath of a conflict that had cost both sides more than either wanted to admit, as a mutual agreement to prevent that scale of loss from ever happening again. "We didn't win that war by being unstoppable," Grace told us, Near the end of our final conversation, her voice quieter than I had heard it at any other point during our visit. We won it by refusing to stop, which is a very different thing, and a much more painful one. Unstoppable sounds like strength. What it actually felt like, from the inside, was simply never being allowed to rest until it was over. We don't want to be that again, if we can possibly help it. That's why we stayed here, quietly, for as long as we could. I sat with that distinction for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind the way I once turned over old fragments of dead languages, searching for the true meaning buried beneath imprecise translation, unstoppable and refusing to stop. On the surface, they sound almost identical. But sitting in that quiet room, listening to a woman who had spent her whole life preparing her community for a danger she hoped would never return, I finally understood that the difference between those two ideas was the entire reason our ancestors had feared humanity enough to write the warning I had once dismissed as legend. It was not their strength that had frightened my people into sealing an entire sector shut. It was the understanding that strength, when paired with a refusal to ever stop trying, becomes something far harder to predict and far harder to survive being on the wrong side of than any single terrible weapon could ever be. As our final evening on the colony approached, Director Osirel began drafting the report he would eventually deliver to the full Concord Council, and he asked me to help him choose the words carefully, aware that whatever we wrote would shape how our people understood humanity for generations to come. I remember sitting beside him long into the night, rewriting sentence after sentence, trying to find language that honored the truth of what we had witnessed, without repeating the fear-driven exaggerations of the old records we had both grown up dismissing. We did not entirely succeed, not that first night, but we had, I think, finally begun to understand what we were actually trying to describe. We left the colony on the 12th day of what was meant to be a brief observation mission, and I remember standing at the small viewing window of the Aldrin's Hollow as the world fell away behind us, feeling less like someone returning home with answers and more like someone leaving with an entirely new set of questions. Grace Whitfield had stood at the edge of the landing field to see us off, and her final words to me, spoken quietly as I boarded the shuttle, stayed with me for the entire journey back. "Tell your people the truth," she said, "not the frightened version, and not a flattering one either, just the truth. We'd rather be understood than feared if we're ever given the choice." I promised her I would try, though I did not yet know how difficult that promise would be to keep. The journey home took the same 11 days as our journey out, but I spent almost none of that time in the ship's small archive terminal reading old fragments the way I had before. Instead, I spent it writing, rewriting, and writing again, trying to translate not a dead language this time, but an entire experience, into something the Concord Council could actually understand without either dismissing it or panicking over it. Director Osirel worked beside me through most of those days, and by the time we reached Concord space, we had produced a report neither of us was fully satisfied with, but one we both believed was, at least, honest. The Council's reaction, when we finally delivered it, was not what either of us expected. There was no panic, as Catherine had feared. There was no dismissal, as I had once assumed there would be. Instead, there was a long, uncomfortable silence, the kind that settles over a room full of people forced to reconsider something they had spent generations treating as settled fact. Director Osirel was asked to present our findings formally, and I stood beside him as translator once more, though this time the language I was translating was not Terran speech, but the difference between fear and understanding, a distinction I was still learning to make clearly myself. "They are not the monsters our oldest records implied," he told the assembled council, "but they are also not the harmless, unremarkable people we assumed them to be, once we saw how modest their world appeared. The truth sits somewhere between those two extremes, and I believe our failure to understand that distinction, generations ago, is precisely what led to the conflict that forced the sealing of their sector in the first place." Catherine, to her credit, asked the question I suspect most of the council was thinking, but hesitant to voice aloud. "Are they a threat to us now?" Director Osirel considered the question carefully before answering, and I found myself holding my breath, unsure which answer I hoped to hear. "Only," he said finally, "if we give them a reason to be. I do not believe they seek conflict. I believe, based on everything we witnessed, that they actively try to avoid it, sometimes at great personal cost. But I also believe, without any doubt at all, that if conflict is forced upon them, they will not simply endure it. They will outlast it, however long that takes, and however much it costs them to do so. That is not a threat. It is simply a fact about who they are, the same way gravity is a fact about a planet's mass. Whether it becomes dangerous to us depends entirely on our own choices, not theirs." The council spent months afterward debating how to formally respond to what our mission had uncovered, and I will not pretend the process was simple or free of disagreement. Some officials argued for renewed isolation, sealing the sector even more firmly than before. Others argued for careful, gradual diplomatic engagement, built slowly on the foundation Director Osirel and I had begun during our brief stay. In the end, a cautious middle path was chosen, one that Grace Whitfield, when informed of it through official channels months later, described in a brief message back to us as a good beginning, even if it isn't everything we might have hoped for. I returned to my work in the Deep Archive not long after the Council's decision was finalized, though I was a very different archivist than the one who had once dismissed the old warnings as exaggerated fear. I was given a new assignment, one I had, in a quiet way, been hoping for since our very first night discovering the Terran signal. I was asked to formally retranslate the ancient pre-silence records, this time without the detachment I had once brought to the task, and with the full weight of first-hand experience shaping every choice I made. It was slow, careful work, and I found myself returning often to that single repeated phrase that had followed me across every fragment I had ever studied. "They do not stop. That is the only warning worth remembering." I understood it differently now than I had on the day I first read it, as a curious, dismissive young archivist. It was not a warning meant to inspire fear for its own sake. It was a warning meant to inspire respect, and more importantly, caution. The kind of caution that prevents unnecessary conflict, rather than the kind that simply hides from it. Our ancestors had not written those words to frighten future generations away from ever engaging with humanity again. They had written them as a kind of apology, a confession of their own mistakes, offered in the hope that whoever eventually broke the seal on that sector would approach what they found with more wisdom than the generation before them had managed. I do not know, even now, everything humanity endured before the conflict that led to their isolation, and I have come to believe that is not entirely my story to tell. What I do know, from the small portion of it Grace Whitfield and her people chose to share with us, is that it left a mark on them deep enough to shape how an entire civilization organized itself for generations afterward, teaching their children to fix what breaks, teaching their engineers to keep trying long after failure would have discouraged anyone else, teaching their leaders to offer every possible chance for peace before ever considering the alternative. Nearly a year after our first mission, I was given the rare privilege of joining a small, carefully arranged follow-up delegation, this time with formal diplomatic status rather than cautious observation as our purpose. I stood once again at the edge of that same modest settlement, and Grace Whitfield greeted me with the same easy smile I remembered from our very first meeting, though this time there was no uncertainty behind it on either side. "You kept your promise," she said, glancing at the small stack of formal Concord documents I carried with me, the beginning of what would eventually become a genuine, if carefully paced, relationship between our two peoples. "I tried," I told her honestly. "I'm not certain I fully succeeded. Some things are difficult to translate completely, no matter how carefully you choose your words." She smiled at that and led me toward the same low bench where we had once sat together watching an unfamiliar sunset, back when I still believed, foolishly, that the ancient tales about her people had finally been proven false. I think about that early, arrogant certainty often, even now, years later, whenever I return to my work in the Deep Archive and find myself once again surrounded by old records that later generations will be tempted to dismiss as exaggeration. I have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the oldest warnings are rarely written by people who wanted to frighten their descendants for no reason. They are written by people who survived something difficult enough to feel the need to leave a record behind, hoping desperately that the next generation might be spared the same mistake. Our ancestors were not wrong about humanity. They were simply incomplete, describing only the fear left behind by a war neither side had wanted, without the context of everything that came afterward, the discipline, the restraint, the quiet, deliberate choice to isolate themselves rather than risk becoming, once again, a danger to anyone they had not chosen to be. I sat with Grace Whitfield that afternoon, watching the same strange, beautiful sunset I remembered from a year before, and I finally understood the full meaning behind the old fragment that had followed me across an entire ocean of dead languages and forgotten records. Unstoppable was never meant as a boast. It was meant as a confession and a warning, and above all, a hope that whoever eventually read those old words carefully enough would choose understanding over fear, the way I finally had. I closed my notes that evening with a single line, one I intended to place at the very beginning of my final report to the Concord archive, replacing the dismissive footnotes I had written before I understood anything at all. The old tales were never exaggerations. They were a mercy, a warning written by people who hoped, against difficult odds, that we would be wise enough not to need to learn its truth the hard way ourselves. We were, in the end, given exactly that chance. And I believe, watching the sun set once more over a world I had once so badly misjudged, that we finally learned to take it,